So I'm going to talk about dietary and food security metrics for the nerds in the room who want to learn more about metrics and how to apply them to the modeling that you're all doing. Let me start with this slide. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. This was the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission paper on planetary health that came out a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't, I encourage you to read it. It talks about the whole era of Anthropocene and the impact on human health. A lot of you have seen different versions of this graph. Tillman and Clark had a paper in Nature. I think I sent it to Joshua, wherever Joshua is, looking at the impact of different diets on greenhouse gas emissions or land use. We usually are looking at how agriculture production systems or how different diets, whether it's vegan, meat-based, Mediterranean, pescatarian, are impacting climate, right? And these climate variables. But we very rarely are, and we don't really understand exactly what all of you are doing. What are the impacts of climate on diet and agriculture? And when you start to look at the literature, there's a lot of literature looking at diet impacts, consumer demand on climate indicators, but not the other way around. There's really a dearth of information on that. We don't really understand from the nutrition community what are the variables that we're looking at. So you'll see some really kind of not very concrete models of looking at climate impacts on nutrition. So I'm gonna throw out a bunch of indicators to all of you, and I'm not gonna be here for the afternoon, but I've used all of these indicators. So please email me if you have questions or wanna understand them more. Some of these probably a lot of you have already seen, but I just want you to think about them in the context of your modeling. So start here first. I'm sorry these are blurry. I have a new MacBook and I couldn't figure out how to make higher quality. Anyway, so this is a paper by my colleague Rosalind Riemanns, who some of you may know, looking at two different indicators, the Shannon Diversity Index, which some of you that work in ecosystems might know, which is looking at species diversity, the number of crops, and then functional diversity, which is looking at those diverse crops and do they have nutritional rich content to them. So looking at production versus supply, if we look at the Shannon diversity and then you look at functional diversity, let's take Northern and West Africa. You see that there's a lot of different crops being grown, a lot of diversity in the number of crops. But then when you look down at the functional diversity, the nutrition is low in those crops. Why is that? Well, in West Africa and Northern Africa, there's a lot of staple cereal crops being grown, but they are not very rich in nutrition. So this kind of information, looking at production and supply, looking at the diversity of the crops being grown or being imported or exported, and then layering on top of that the nutritional diversity of those crops can give you a lot of information. You can look at this at the global level. You can look at this at the country level. This is showing you production diversity and supply diversity of Malaysia. Sorry, this is supposed to be Ghana. And you can really see the split over time with Malaysia having a lot of diversity in their crops and the supply. That makes sense because Malaysia is importing a lot of their food. So most of the diversity that's coming in that consumers have access to is coming in from imports, not from production within the country. And obviously that very much parallels the economics of a country. So you can kind of look at some of these data and think about how to layer climate modeling on top of that. This is a paper we just published in Science, and a lot of you are already doing this, but even looking at crops and the nutritional content of that, Christina went into that a little bit, we see that in nutrition, we don't care so much about energy, maybe just from the obesity perspective, but we really care about micronutrients. You can see over time, these are looking at 8 different major crops. Iron and zinc have been decreasing over time. And some of you in the audience have even looked at that and the impacts of climate change on the nutrient content of those crops. We've also proposed a new nutritional yield indicator. I don't have time to go into it, but I'm happy to talk to any of you about that. So some different metrics looking more at the global and national level. There's a lot of work happening right now at the landscape level and the farm level. We're very interested in the nutrition perspective of looking at multifunctional landscapes. So while a lot of you are already looking at water, livestock, crop diversity, what are some of the nutrition and health implications on these landscapes and the multifunctionality of these landscapes? This is where we're working in the Barotse floodplain in Zambia. Some of you may have worked in this area. It's a lot of seasonal variation, and the functionality of that landscape changes by seasons. And you can imagine the climate impacts when you start to account for seasonality. Some of the indicators that we're looking at, along with the production and ecosystem indicators, are diet quality. I'll talk a bit about those. Food safety, like aflatoxin, which is a huge contributor, it is thought, a huge contributor to stunting. And in places like rural Kenya, 60% of crops are contaminated with aflatoxin. You can look at morbidity data like malaria, diarrhea, upper respiratory tract infections. These all co-localize with some of these different agronomic and water management practices. And we can also apply the indicator I talked about earlier, the nutritional functional diversity indicator at the landscape or at the farm level, by looking at species compositions on farms, looking at the nutritional composition of those species. And then you're able to then look at the diversity, the functional diversity of meeting nutritional needs if you have more diversity on a farm system. But right now there's a lot of controversy about homestead food production and its contribution to dietary diversity. Maybe some of you saw this PNAS paper that came out. They looked at smallholder farm households in Indonesia, Kenya, Ethiopia, Malawi, and found that most of the access to dietary diversity did not come from on-farm, it came from markets. So again, it's getting back to Adam's emphasis that, as all of you know, smallholder farmers are net buyers, and they are getting most of their food from a market. And a lot of that is becoming processed even in the most remote rural areas. So something to keep in mind. Interesting paper, controversial at the moment for those who are very promoting homestead food production. Okay, so 3 food security measures that some of you may have seen, really validated by USAID and FANTA, are these 3 indicators: the months of adequate household food provisioning, food insecurity access scale, and dietary diversity score. These have been validated, they've been used a lot. I'll give you examples of the first bullet and the third bullet. The food insecurity access scale is a coping scale. It's 10 questions. If you don't have enough food, I had to do X. I had to take my child out of school. I had to borrow money. I had to sell my livestock. So that's a coping metric. The top one is more of a food availability metric, and the last one really starts to get at nutrition and diets. This is just an example of the monthly provisioning, percentage of a total population reporting they do not have enough food in that month. This was data that we collected in Malawi. You can clearly see the seasonality of maize, right? And if you overlay the question, do you not have enough maize in that month, it naturally overlays with the seasonality and the hunger period. Very basic, easy question on food availability. A lot of people use it. Household dietary diversity. This is looking across 5 different sites in Kenya, Malawi, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Ghana, looking at year 0 and year 3, and you collect everything that someone ate for the last 24 hours. There's other methods to do it. You can do it 48 hours, you can do it over a month. And you look over time to see if they have increased dietary diversity. And you can put these foods into food groups. And you can look to see if they've improved the diversity. They consume more food items or more food groups. And you can see somewhere like Ethiopia, we saw over time they had more dietary diversity. This is considered statistically significant. But you can see over time the changes in the different food groups. And this is the most interesting one that you see. And this is in rural Ethiopia, increase in sweets. More income, people consume luxury foods, we call them. They'll buy a cell phone, they'll buy a TV, and they will buy food. They'll buy meat, but they also buy alcohol, they buy sweets, processed foods. So you'll see this everywhere, right? You just see everyone likes luxury foods. We all do it, right? We're doing it right now in Aspen. I spent so much money on a steak the other night. Anyway, so diet diversities are really important. SCORE, and there's a lot of movement around that. Those 3 indicators are collected a lot. Those surveys have been validated. A lot of people use them. You see them in demographic health surveys. These 4 are great metrics, but not so systematically collected. There's the Women's Dietary Diversity Score that Christina mentioned, just now coming online. No one's collecting it really. It was developed in West Africa. I was talking to my colleague back there. Really developed for understanding how when people eat communally out of the same bowl like they do in West Africa. Infants minimum acceptable diet, I'll show you that in a minute. OptiFood, a linear programming model, I'm sure Adam uses that a lot or has, and cost of diets. So really quick, this is showing you Women's Dietary Diversity Score in Northern Kenya that we collected on. Again, you look across food groups, you can have 24 food groups, you can have 12, you can divvy them up in a lot of different ways. But this is, and we looked more at some of these more nutritious products and doing groupings that way. But you can see kind of the distribution, and clearly everyone's eating grains, roots, and tubers, and very little of other things. Minimum acceptable diet. So why women, really quick? Women are one of the most vulnerable populations, right? So it's from a nutritional perspective. So we really are interested in understanding women's diets because it influences the household. The other vulnerable group is young children, children under 2. We call it the first 1,000 days from conception to the 2 years of age. That's the most vulnerable period, and it's the window of opportunity where you can act to improve nutrition. After that, the window somewhat shuts. So it's really important to think about diets in children under 2. The big nutrient gaps is zinc and iron. And you can see here's Honduras. Sorry, this is so blurry. Minimum acceptable diet. Most children only get 52% of children in Honduras get a minimum acceptable diet. That means enough calories and enough diet diversity. This indicator is starting to be collected in all DHS, demographic health surveys. Great indicator. WHO and UNICEF are the keepers of that. OptiFood looks at local foods and the combinations of local foods through linear programming and looks at gaps in nutrients from local foods. And what do you see that's in red across these different sites in young children is zinc and iron. These are the huge nutrient gaps. We don't care so much about calories. Something for you to consider. Cost of diet, this is done by Save the Children and World Food Program. World Food Program is collecting this in all of the countries where they're working now. Looking at what is the minimal diet cost for a day and what's the person's income. And if you look at Ethiopia, here's Burma, Tanzania, people cannot afford their basic diet. There's a nutrient and an income gap, an indicator that everyone's looking at. So I've put up a bunch of data sources for all of you of where you can access different websites and survey data. I've put in all the food composition. Obviously we use FAO stat, but I've put in this cost of diet, all the WHO pertinent databases, UNICEF databases. So you have that. I hope everyone gets these slides. Can I just say one quick thing, Adam? Okay. This is just a plug. Global Nutrition Report has a ton of data and has country profiles on the website. So if you want to look at all 193 countries, you can do that. We're also working on a global food ethics project with Bill Easterling, who some of you might know at Penn. There's a climate project within this. I encourage, if anyone's interested at the ethical elements of climate smart agriculture, please get in contact with me. And I think we have to just think about, and this will lead into Adam's. Adam was talking about how we shouldn't really be thinking so much right now about health and anthropometry indicators. Anthropometry being body measures, that's stunting, wasting, obesity. But they're really, really important when looking at seasonality, and they can be good predictors. So this was in the Global Nutrition Report climate chapter. Stunting varies from season to season and year to year. And they can serve as proxies for what's happening with seasons. And you can also look at how people acquire food seasonally. And these can be triggers for why we're seeing children who are stunted. The other one, and this is my last slide, is wasting. We measure wasting by weight and height, but now I'm sure some of you who have worked in more humanitarian or emergency situations are seeing what they're called MUAC bands. They measure the mid-upper arm circumference. And these measures are the biggest predictor of mortality for children. But they could also serve and be linked with early warning systems for climate. So a lot of people in the field are doing MUAC measurements, and it's really easy to do. I could train all of you guys in 10 minutes. I do with my students. And this could be a good trigger for these early warning systems along with some of the climate indicators we're seeing. So while we've talked about ignore some of those anthropometry indicators, do consider them when you're thinking about seasonality, early warning measurements, and things like that. So that's it.